Peacemakers Horrors of War truly is my favourite co-op game that I have in my collection right now. Now, what separates this game and elevates it above all of the co-op games in my collection? Well, let's go find out. Let's be clear, Peacemakers is not actually a war game. This is a strategic manipulation game where your loyalties are not actually with either warring faction, but it's more the concept that you're that neutral party that's trying to find peace through shaping and influencing those particular battlefields. Through covert operations, you'll assist in dealing damage, influencing troops to move around, create fortifications, and infiltrate army orders to always just be that one step ahead. The greatest lesson I've ever learned is that positive change comes through decisive action. I refuse to trust the waves of fate ever again. In Peacemakers Horrors of War, you play as one of 4 animal creatures whose job is to shape the warring factions around them to create peace and stability in the area. The first step in Peacemakers is to choose a scenario. Now, there's 6 scenarios in the book. Once you've chosen one, there's going to be some backstory and also some particular information that's tied to that scenario. Next up, you've got your game board all set up with all the factions in the right spots. Now, let's deal 4 cards to each player. Now, depending on the players, you just got to split them up amongst the players. So if it's 2 players, 2 cards each. Nice and easy. Now, these cards, they're going to have 5 different things you can do on them. You can use them to survey, which is looking at the army orders. You get to flip one of them over, so you've got an idea what the army is going to do in advance. Next up, you've got travel. So we're going to be able to travel around the board because we need to be right in the same hex as a particular warring faction to be able to do things to that faction, to be able to manipulate that faction. Next up, we can create fortifications. Next, we can delegate. If we're in the same faction as one of the other players that we're playing with, we can delegate our cards over to that person. And then lastly, there's some scheme down the bottom. So certain abilities that each of these cards can do, which you can also play. So now we've got our cards out, let's get into how does the army play. Armies require army orders, so let's flip all of the army orders over, and then let's look at the numbers on those cards. Add them up for each faction, and whoever has the highest number will go first. From there, it's nice and simple. Just do the actions, left card first, followed by right card. The only thing to note is each one of these cards normally affects a particular group. So just gotta look at the base of each of those meeples to make sure they're the right group that you're affecting. And finally, let's check the motivation tracks. Now, each warring faction are gonna have motivation tracks. Now, this is gonna tell us, do they still have an appetite for war? Or if they're in the green section, then they're ready, their motivation has dropped and they're ready to get into peace talks. If both factions are green, then you have won the game. Now, that's pretty much it. If you haven't got into the green, well, it's time to play another round. Grab 4 more resource cards, spread them amongst the players, and then crack on. But before we go on, a couple of little things to note here. You can play your cards at any time, so talk amongst your team. Yeah, this is a proper co-op, so discuss when is the best time to play cards. The other thing is, you don't always have to play cards. Hold on to them. They will carry over from round to round. And lastly, every time a warring faction loses a member, one of their members dies, you're going to get a horror card. This is going to go to the top of the resource deck, and that means the very next round, this is going to come into play, and obviously, it's going to make life a lot more challenging for you. Now, right at the start, I said this is my favorite co-op game, and I'm just going to add some caveats to it. I'm not including my campaign games, ISS Vanguard, Lands of Galzia, and Sleeping Gods. Look, I love all those games, but I only ever play them solo, so I don't really count them as co-op as much. But anyway, what I am going to compare it to is Spirit Island. Now, Spirit Island was one of my favorite co-op games, and it's got the same sort of thing where we have battling factions. But the difference between this and Peacemakers is that neutrality aspect. In Spirit Island, you're going to be playing as one of those factions, and you're going to be really helping one side win. In this game, you can't focus on one side, you must balance both sides. So 1 second you're supporting the bears and you're helping them win the battle, next minute they're getting too strong and your support is going to shift to the birds. You're trying to bring them both down equally to both get in that green so they can get into peace talks. It is such a unique take on a board game, and I've never had that experience before, and I thoroughly loved it. The games are so tight, the scenarios are so tight. Quite often I will lose, and I'm more than happy to lose in a game because I know I was tight, I know I had a chance, I know my strategic choices lost me the game. The next thing is, this is my favorite co-op game because my partner wanted to play this with me. She hates co-ops with an absolute passion, and I mean that seriously. She will not play them. If I say, let's play co-op, she will roll her eyes and walk away and do something else. But in Peacemakers, she thoroughly enjoyed this. There was something so interesting about this to her that it felt like a co-op game that she would play again. And that is so rare, and that is why I absolutely love this game. So let's get into the pros, cons, and let's talk about a few strategy tips. What I truly love about this game is the balance between the randomness elements and the strategic elements. Now, the randomness will take place via the cards. You're going to have your army order cards, your resource cards, and your horror cards. You can mitigate the army orders via surveying, so that's really good. But the fact that we're always going to have a mixture of different horrors and a mixture of different resources is really going to shape the way the scenario plays out. And that randomness just gives you that replayability factor. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the tightness in the game. That's one thing I really noticed about the design in this game is every single scenario I played seemed to come down to the wire. And a lot of times I lost and I was happy to lose. So I've talked about the tightness before, and I really like that in the gameplay. So there's nothing worse than a co-op game that just feels like you're going through the motions and you're going to win every time. This one, you have to work for your wins, and that's a really good feeling. The last thing I want to chat about is the ease of setup. So there's nothing stopping you after you've played this game a few times, having from start to finish setup in, let's say, less than 4 or 5 minutes. Yeah, it's pretty easy to set up. Now, these books here, they come in with different halves of maps. So you're gonna have 2 books. You've got half a map on this one, half a map on the other one. Now you're gonna put both those 2 maps together to combine a scenario. But what's stopping you from playing this random map and then pick some other random map? Because every time you have a random map, you're gonna have a random faction underneath it. It's a really cool way to add that extra replayability. You're creating your own scenarios, and that's something I really like to make sure that this game has some longevity. Cool, we have all these awesome hexes, and we have our soldier, and that soldier may have a bit of damage, and that hex has some fortifications. Cool, that's awesome. But now we've just got to move that soldier forward, and now the damage needs to come forward, and that hex also has fortifications, and it has the enemy, also has my adventurer meeple, and there's also icons we need to check out. Can get a little bit of hectic, a little bit crazy sometimes on some of these hexes, but certainly not a deal breaker. The main issue I have with this game is just ambiguity on some of the cards. Now, an FAQ is going to 100% fix this, but the problem is when I checked out the FAQ, it was very quiet, very empty, very sparse. So, look, that's fine. As more and more people play this game, hopefully all those questions will get asked, get put on the FAQ, and all of a sudden, bingo, we have no more ambiguity. So it never hurts just to let the war play out at the start of the game. You don't know which side's winning or losing until the war starts. So maybe that first round, save some cards and let the war play out. Next up from there, we need to understand what are those motivation triggers. Now you're going to see them in every deck of cards for the army orders, and there's going to be certain ones that are going to help you note which ones will drop the motivation and which ones will raise the motivation. As soon as you know those, you need to start working towards those to be able to drop that motivation to the green peace talk level. Next up, little leaders. These are special guys and gals because we need to protect them at all costs. If we ever lose a leader on any side, their motivation for war drops to 0 and the game is over. So always protect the leaders. And my last tip is the little survey action right at the top of the card. This is your very best friend. If you know what the armies are about to do beforehand, you can at least try your best to try and help manipulate that situation. So there's a few tips. If you really like games like Spirit Island, then I can highly recommend Peacemakers Horrors of War as an alternative for that co-op games night. Also, from Snowdale Design, Lands of Galzia, it made my top 50 board games of all time. If you haven't seen that video, why not check it out right there.